Another topic that's important to me are the community assets that are still owned by the Woodlands Development Company or Howard Hughes. We enjoy the waterway, for example. There's boating on the waterway, buildings built around the waterway, but the township doesn't own the waterway. That's owned by the Woodlands Development Company. People enjoy Lake Woodlands, boating on Lake Woodlands, fishing on Lake Woodlands, looking at Lake Woodlands, but the township does not own Lake Woodlands. It leases it from the developer. These are the two big examples of what I would call community assets that are still in the hands of the developer. Now, this is not some nefarious plot on the part of the developer to own vital assets and use it as a club. It's simply that the developer developed the Woodlands. Mr. Mitchell had a grand dream, and it's the people and the entity called the Woodlands Development Company, the Woodlands Corporation, it changed its name over time, that brought that dream to reality. And it was that entity acquired the land, dug the lake, Woodlands, for example, filled it full of water, just like with the waterway. And it's just time for us to address those community assets and get them in the hands of the township. So it's time to get more aggressive in negotiating with the developer to transfer these community assets to the township. Now, in light of our budgetary problems, we can't be quite as aggressive as I would like to be, but the township has been addressing this issue in the past, but I think we need to move more quickly to get these issues resolved. Some of the assets, it may be a simple negotiation. Others are going to be more difficult. For example, the developer owns little access easements here and there all over mainly the downtown portion of the Woodlands. Again, they don't own it for some nefarious purpose, but when they build buildings, they need access, they get an easement. Well, that easement needs to be in the hands of the township, so it can be used by the residents of the Woodlands as a public easement. The other really big item that the township owns, that the developer owns, are rights to change land use designations. When property is sold in the Woodlands, it's restricted to a particular use. The residential area, it's all restricted to, maybe single family, maybe multifamily. In the commercial, it's restricted for nonprofit, for hospital, for retail, for strip center, apartment house. Every piece of land when sold in the Woodlands is restricted to a particular purpose or purposes. Now, these are not these restrictions aren't in the nature of a zoning ordinance. They're not imposed upon the land by a public body. These are agreements between the seller of the land, usually the Woodlands Development Company or Howard Hughes, and the buyer of the land. Maybe it was you when you bought your house, or maybe it's the guy that runs the liquor store down the street when he bought a piece of land to build his liquor store, or any other buyer of commercial land in the Woodlands. And so it takes an agreement of those two parties to change the use of a particular piece of property once it's restricted. Over time, uses change in any community. The example I use are the 5-acre plots, 5-acre tracts that are designated as church sites. Mr. Mitchell's vision was that a church didn't need any more than 5 acres adjacent to some form of public parking, like a school or a park, where people going to church could park there and then walk across the street and use the facilities, the synagogue or the church or the mosque on the church site. Well, as we've seen, some of these churches, 5 acres is a small parking lot. They've outgrown the 5-acre church site. And over time, those sites, which are usually on good corners and in high visibility areas, the highest and best use may change. It may be the market may say, well, we need to put a little townhouse on this 5-acre church plot. Well, to do that, the restrictions have to be changed because all those 5-acre tracts are by agreement of the buyer and the seller restricted to nonprofit or church use. So you're going to have to go back and get the parties or their successors, their heirs, whoever succeeded to that authority to change the use. Now, these changes in land use won't occur overnight. It may be years from now before the market says that this piece of property that at one time was restricted nonprofit is better utilized as an apartment house, for example. Well, at the time that happens, you're going to have to track down and find the parties that have the right to change the land use designation. And the longer, further in the future that the use has to be changed, the more difficult it's going to be to locate the parties that have that authority, and the more difficult it's going to be to negotiate a change, because you're liable to run into a situation where the parties that have that authority aren't in the woodlands, don't know anything about the woodlands, don't much care about the woodlands. They know they have a right to change a land use, and they'll want a bunch of money for it. So to avoid those kind of problems in the future, I think it's important now for the township to try to negotiate with the developer to obtain these rights to change land use designations and land use restrictions. So why now? Why is it important to think about this issue now? It's been an ongoing process. For several years, the township has been chipping away at working out arrangements to acquire these assets from the developer. It's more important now because Howard Hughes has announced that it's interested in selling some of its portfolio, which includes the woodlands. And, if they sell and the property is transferred to a new owner, then we have a new owner to educate. We have a new owner to deal with that has no relationship to the woodlands. So why do I think this issue of acquiring community assets is important enough to deal with today? My concern is that we know the Howard Hughes Corporation has put its assets up for sale, or at least is thinking about it. I think the township would be in much better shape negotiating with the Howard Hughes Corporation rather than negotiating with an unknown buyer of the Howard Hughes Corporation or its assets. There was another planned community called Reston, Virginia, that was started about the same time as the Woodlands. And its developer, the Roush Company, did what the Woodlands Development Company has done here. It sold, developed, and finally got to a point where it made more sense for them to go ahead and sell the remaining undeveloped land and exit the community. Well, it didn't sell to just one successor entity. It sold to 4 successor entities. And you can imagine what it would be a hassle if that happened in this community. Instead of going to one successor entity to negotiate, you would have 4, none of which really had the history of the woodlands, didn't really know what they were buying. And I think it would have been much more difficult negotiation. I also think from Howard Hughes' perspective, a lot of what we call assets are really, from their perspective, a liability. The Lake Woodlands, the waterway, that isn't an asset. That's a big liability. That's a drowning getting ready to happen. That's a boating accident getting ready to happen where they're going to sue the injured party, or the heirs of the dead person will sue everybody that has to do with that lake, including the owner of the lake, the Woodlands Development Corporation, or Howard Hughes. And so I think from Howard Hughes' perspective, if you're interested in selling your assets, you want to clean up your balance sheet and get these oddball assets, liabilities off your balance sheet. So they may be more motivated to come to the table and negotiate the transfer of these properties and rights than a buyer from them would be.